Well, General Price, thanks so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have any time to just sit and talk with you about anything. And I know we're going to cover a lot of ground today about your military service in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and certainly some of the early history of the memorial itself. So thank you very much for spending the time with me today.
I'm honored to be a part of this program. I just think that the memorial and whatever I gave to it certainly was deserved many times over. So I would do it all over again, plus some if I could, so that the young folks have something to remember those heroes and heroines that we had in that era in Vietnam.
Well, sir, if it makes sense to you, what I'd like to do is start a little bit early in your career. You graduated ROTC from South Carolina State University in 1951. And as I understand, your graduating class was the first that actually was able to take ROTC for a full 4 years. So you were a bit of a maverick even before you got to the United States Army.
Well, there's a little history here because, and I need to go back to my hometown of Laurel, Mississippi, which I give great credit for giving me a good jump start. It started with my parents, and of course, they set the tone and the community in general. And military service was sort of expected behavior. We grew up in World War II. We went through all of those eras, and you were sort of expected to serve. As a side note, one of the most difficult things you could do in our society, in our community, was to go down to the draft board to take the physical coming into the Army and fail. When you got back, you had a little isolation that was all set by the community saying, I told you something was wrong with that boy, you know, so by the time they finished dissecting you, you'd volunteer to jump off a mountain. So, but you were sort of expected to serve in all branches of service, Navy, Air Force. Tuskegee was always big in our world because it was one of the universities we all aspired to go to, along with several other historically black colleges and universities. But that was one of the main ones because of its rich history of great Americans that they produced and the leadership that those faculty members and directors and those gave us. And so far as South Carolina State was concerned, I was told by my mentor, Colonel Hannah Knight, who lived in Soso, Mississippi, which was a little community about 10 miles from Laurel. And he served, and his brother served in the military. And they were family friends. So they would come by the house as they proceeded to go through the service graduation up from going into as a private, and both of them were commissioned. And they told me that, he said, what do you like to do? And I told him, I'd like to be like him. And he said, well, the first thing you want to do is go to college. And I said, why? He said, because the time for any officer who has a commission that's worth it is going to have a college degree. You don't need to wait when you can get it ahead of time. So you need to prepare to go to college. So that was a guidance I got on how you start a military career, what the preparation required. So as I looked for colleges to attend, I was an athlete. And so I was hopeful that I'd be able to get a scholarship. And good fortune was that I got offered a scholarship to South Carolina State, which I accepted. And that was the year that they had President Miller had decided to form the ROTC unit at South Carolina State. It had already been approved and everything was done, but simply to staff it, build the resources. Since this was at the end of World War II, we had a complete portion of the campus that was called Vetville. And that's where all the veterans who came back lived. That's where their dormitories were. And so you had an exposure of many of the people who had served worldwide in World War II when we started our ROTC unit. That put us a little bit ahead. And we had some top-notch officers there, all of whom, for the most part, I think all of them were college graduates. And of course, the professor of military science, Colonel James Robinson, was one of our preeminent African-American officers serving on active duty at that time. And he started our ROTC unit. And that's how we got out of our ground start. And I got an athletic scholarship to go to South Carolina State to play football. But I mentioned to Coach that I wanted to take ROTC. He said, do both. You never got out. When you told him you had aspirations, your plate was never too full. And they were not going to let you turn loose any of your dreams, one over the other. And so you never made any ground by coming and telling that. He said, do it all. You know, that's it. I had my guidance. And it's like to be inspired, I guess my parents had the right idea, well, whether I was going to make the team or whether I was going to be in school or not, because they sent me to South Carolina State 2 weeks early with a one-way ticket.
So you knew what direction your future was going.
I was motivated. And so I got there early and met one of the greatest families I'll ever know, and that's the Weber family. And I arrived in Orangeburg on the Atlantic Coast Line train, 5 o'clock in the morning, knew nobody. And it was me and a cab driver named Dash's Cab that met the train. And I got on there with, I had a nice sized piece of luggage. I don't remember what was in it, but it wasn't very much. And so he said, where do you want to go? And I said, I want to go to South Carolina State, to the main part of the campus so I can try to find a room. And he said, did you know the school was closed? I said, no, I was told to report for football practice. He said, well, everybody's going for that break between the summer and fall sessions. Let me see what I can do to find you somewhere to stay, because I think everything's locked up. So we drove through the campus early in the morning, nobody out there but me and the cab driver and the campus. And nothing was open. He tried some of the old dormitories, the new dormitories, the veterans dormitories. He said, well, the only thing left to do now is to go find Mr. Weber and see if he's got in a room, because he'll let you stay with him, I'm sure. So I went down and he took me to Mr. Weber's house and knocked on the door. And Mr. Weber said, well, Mr. Weber, I got a football player out here that came in. He's early. He's from Mississippi and he needs a place to stay. And Mr. Weber told him, well, geez, I'd like to keep him here, but I'm sorry. I got a house full of relatives laying there. I got them sleeping on pallets on the floor, so I don't have any more room. But hang on a minute, let me see what they got to school on the campus. So he's a football player? Yeah, well, I think I know the dormitory they're gonna put the athletes in. So let's go up there and see. They had a lot of converted barracks that they'd taken off the post in World War II, moved them there, set up a circular ring of several of those type barracks, which was called Vetville. And so that's what the veterans are going to move into. He took me up to the campus, and Mr. Weber was in the car with us, of course, and he said, I think this is going to be the building, because none of the others had lights on, and this was the only one. So he walked up to the building and said, I think this might work. And he just pulled the plank off the door and opened it.
And you had a home.
And said, let me see if they got lights in here. And turned the lights on, and the lights came on. He said, okay, Price, I'll deal with this tomorrow, but right now you need a place to stay. So go in there and pick your room. Oh, this is breaking and entering where I come from. And so I went
sir, toward the end of your time there at South Carolina State, you graduated in 1951. And shortly after graduation there, the Korean War started. So I assume you were still in some of your follow-on training after graduation. And then tell me, how did you find out that you were going to Korea? And I'd like to talk a little bit about your experience in the Korean War.
Well, this goes through back to the same continuation from South Carolina State, because we all got commissioned, and everybody who had been in summer camp together came back for the basic infantry officers course at Fort Benning. So we all knew each other from the preceding year. We were sitting on the bank at one of our classes when the newsboy came by and said, extra, Korean American forces committed in Korea. that notified us that the war had started. We committed our forces, and we looked around and said, well, guess all them trips to Germany are history. And 90% of us, if not more, got orders to Korea. And so it was just like the camp was shifted in terms of context. And we all went about our ways after we graduated from the basic course and, sort of filtered out throughout the army. Some of whom went to Europe, very few, but 90% of us, if not more, went to Korea on orders to serve. And that's all the basic courses, artillery, army, and whatever it was. So we went into those places. Be mindful that the year I started South Carolina State was a year the president signed the desegregation order for the military services. And so we were working through all the how we're going to do that and how they're going to do that type thing, some of which had started at the end of World War II. But the fact of the matter is, you had all these dynamics going on while you were trying to pursue a hot war. It was interesting, retrospectively. At the time we were doing it, they were teaching
Can you tell me a little bit about what was the mood like in the country when you went to Korea? I mean, was there concern and a lot of talk about communist aggression? Was that something that really was described in that way as the Cold War was just getting started? Was there support among the American people for sending troops to Korea?
I can't talk to that from a practical point of view as I could now. I think you had the support of the people because they respected and admired the armed forces. ROTC was popular, and many of them had taken ROTC as an alternative to other courses that they had. And of course, when you took the infantry as your course, then you knew that you were going to be in the front line of the battlefield. We just didn't know where the battlefield was going to start before we got a heads up start. And you knew we were well trained. And so it was simply a matter of, okay, how do you fix that? As a minority officer, we had to figure out, okay, where we're going to be assigned. I was assigned to the 45th Infantry Division of the 45th Division, Oklahoma National Guard. This is when all these units were being desegregated and across the board. And there's nothing more exciting than going into a new unit from a new circumstance, from on a what you guess today they call it a social subject, and getting ready to go on a combat patrol when you got introduced to your troops. That was not what the teaching was. So we survived all of that. I discovered that later on that where I was wounded in North Korea, above the 38th parallel, not in South Korea. But the fact is, it was a unique experience. It was battlefield training, and I'm delighted and honored to have been able to serve so many distinguished soldiers. The social ramifications of it are completely different. All of the things you hear about social situations are unique. The soldiers had difficulty adjusting until the guns started going off. And then when it was one army, one group, everybody trying to save everybody else. It was a great levelizer. And
yeah, so race didn't matter much once the bullets started flying.
Yep. And so it was an interesting undertaking. I was in Korea for a very brief period of time. And then I spent 6 months in the hospital. And so
you were wounded and you earned the Purple Heart as a result of your service in Korea.
So yes.
Okay.
I was evacuated, medevac, 8055 MASH Hospital, and 121st evac. Then I spent about 3 or 4 months in Osaka, Japan, in recovery. Mm-hmm. So then I was transferred back to the States, and I went to Blacksburg, Virginia, to finish my recovery. Mm-hmm. Brave that I was as a second lieutenant, asked me where I want to go for recovery. I put Walter Reed, and they said, yeah, right. I was out there in Blacksburg, Virginia. Next thing I knew, without a car.
Well, so what year did you go to Vietnam?
I went to Vietnam in 1962, I want to say it was.
Okay.
And I was there when we had advisors. We didn't have any major American units. We had an advisory team. We had 8,000 people emerged with the Vietnamese Army. I served with the 1st Army Division, 1st Army Division, in the northernmost line in South Vietnam. We were deployed along the DMZ and over to Laos and down to Laos to where you got the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Inside Vietnam, we had a Louis Ashau Tabat. Those were outposts that we took charge of. We had advisory teams that were composed of 3 to 4 people, and they 5 at the, I think is an authorized number, which we never had. And we literally lived with the Vietnamese. We had our own place when we were back in garrison, but when we were out in the field, we all stayed together.
You were attached as advisors to a Vietnamese Army unit,
yes.
A South
I
Vietnamese
served I served with the 1st Arvin Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, Arvin.
Okay.
And,
well, a lot of people don't realize it, but we had advisors in Vietnam as early as 1950. You know, and you're a perfect example of that. Over time, the number of advisors we had there increased, and the kinds of things they were asked to do became more and more diverse and more dangerous. And then, of course, there were more and more people who were killed as a result. When you went to the Vietnam War, there was still pretty strong support for our advisors being there. Is that right?
to the best of my knowledge, we didn't have the benefit of CNN and all these other places to go out and give you the hot news. Your focus was on where you were supposed to be assigned and the mission of that unit. And you tried to develop the best relationship you could. Only a fool likes war. You see, so the idea is whatever you could do to contribute to its end, you did it. You were concurrently getting familiar with, you know, all the tradition and all the history and going back to France and all this other business. It was great to know, it was great to learn, it was great to be able to pick up the ball and run with it. But we did it as American advisors to the Vietnamese Army. I thought the 1st Arvin Division was as good a division as anyone could serve with. We had great officers. My counterpart in the 1st Regiment was a brilliant officer. He attended all of the American schools in the military that I did. He went to the career course at Fort Benning. I went to the career course at Fort Benning. He was there as a lieutenant. I was there. They had so many. They had a pool hall at Fort Benning called Pusan Pool Hall. And so it was, you know, it's that kind of interaction. So we were not strangers. He spoke good English. I spoke damn near no Vietnamese, and French was not my strong subject either. But we got along and we understood because he understood me, and we agreed in philosophy. I learned a lot from him, as indeed he learned from me. So it was a great experience to do that. I was there when they had, when President Kennedy was assassinated, and I was there when they had the March on Washington. That's when the head game came in. What in the world is going on back home? What is wrong with these people? They got to be out of their freaking minds. I'm hearing the news out of Laos, put on the enemy's radio to let us know what was going on back in the States. And all the games they were playing on false information and all that business, we had it big time. But
so you were there for what, a year and a half, 2 years?
I was there for a year.
Okay.
And then I came back to the Command General Staff College, and you know, we did those assignments. And after the Command General Staff College, I went to Washington D.C. To be assigned, and I was dealing with the reserve components. And fortunately, I'd served in a reserve component unit, the 45th Division. The reserve components are called the U.S. composed of the U.S. Army Reserve and the National Guard and other specialized units that were called the reserve components. And so you had those interactions also, but I did not go in as a uninformed And of course, you had the social issues you were dealing with. You had the social issues you were dealing with in Vietnam. You had social issues you were dealing with anywhere you went.
Well, you realize when you got home that some of those news stories that you heard through the enemy's radio, they were real. So there was a lot going on back home while you were there.
Yeah, we recognize that. We recognize that. And we had parallel, I guess, the Sears transoceanic radio was the most popular radio going because that was the one that had shortwave and all this other good stuff. And so we made sure each unit had one so they could tune in by shortwave and get the information that they needed to hear on the real news from back home. So but our supply was all done on an individual basis based on where we were located. And again, I have great respect and admiration for the people who served in the Army in that area, the Corps commander and all of the other folks in that area had their heads screwed on right. There was no confusion, and they did their job with great knowledge, courage, and devotion to their country. Now,
well, and while you were there for that year, you were in Vietnam. Did you have the misfortune of losing any of your soldiers?
No, we did not. I lost a couple of the disease, but I never lost any of the enemy fire. We did not have that much density. We had a lot of enemy attacks because we had Ashau, Louis, Tabat. I was there when I tried to convince the special forces that Kayshawn was not the damn place to put that outpost. And I said, you're going to be dependent on me to come out here and rescue you every weekend, and I'm not going to do that. Because the 1st Regiment had all that border from the Laotian border over to past Kayshawn. What's that going to do? And so that's the kind of thing that we had to deal with in debate, because the coordination at ground level was not as good as it could have been. But the fact of the matter is we respected each other had a mission, and we're certainly not going to let any of our people get maimed and killed if there was anything we could do about it. So that was a given.
So you came home in 1963 from Vietnam the first time.
I didn't go back.
Excuse me?
I did not go back to Nam.
You did not go back.
I volunteered 9 times and they could not accommodate me, apparently. So.
Well, and what was your rank when you returned home?
Major.
You were a major by then. And did I understand correctly that General Colin Powell actually served in the same unit as you at one point?
Yes, Colin Powell was one of my young advisors at the battalion level. He was a captain. We were serving together at the time when his son was born. And he was out on an outpost and had a problem with communications, and that was the great debate as to, well, how we're going to get it notified and all that business. And while they were arguing, I got on the helicopter and flew out there.
So you got to tell him that his son had been born.
And I said, yeah, come here, your son has been born and your wife is doing great. And I want you to get on the airplane and go and call her so that she can know that you're okay and relieve the tension. And he came up and said, well, sir, I can't go. And I said, that wasn't a question. That was an order. Get on the airplane. I'll take care of this mess out here. You take care of them when you get back. And that started a relationship that lasted for the rest of his life. And he was brilliant then, and he was brilliant through the rest of his career. And we always stayed in touch from that day forward. And he's a great friend, great soldier, and deserved every accolade he got. He was super, and so was his family. I developed at that point in my career that when you get in a situation like this, it was the military and the family, not the military or the family. You were not an adversary, you were part of the same group. So you have to start planning that way as a family. And when you did that, it eased a lot of the burden that you had when you got orders in the middle of a school system year or something like that. It just took a lot of common sense and applying it and giving up a little few things that you might otherwise have had. You rearranged it, but it was always and most folks come out with, you are the family. So no. It's and the family. And I still believe that's the way you approach it.
Well, we're not going to get into that too much, but certainly that approach has been adopted by the military since, a lot more so than in years before, and I think it has served them well. So after your time in Vietnam, where did you go?
Vietnam, I came back to the Command General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth for a year. And when I finished that, I was assigned to Washington, D.C. to the Chief Officer of Reserve Components in the Pentagon.
Right.
And I stayed there for 3 years. And that's when I did all the volunteering to go back to Vietnam. And they couldn't seem to accommodate me. I said, okay, be my guest. And I got promoted in the process. And so I lost my patience and and I worked for the Army Chief of Staff in his office at that time. And he had gone through the same trauma of trying to get an assignment in his career. And so I went over to the building and asked to be assigned to Vietnam because the division commander had asked that I be assigned there. And the guy, well, so and so and so and so. I said, okay, I'm gonna stop by the chief's office when I go back to work and just be sure he knows that that's what's happening in these situations. And he said it was not going to occur. By the time I got from Southwest Washington back to the Pentagon, I was offered a job as a battalion commander in Panama. And so I accepted that assignment because if I turned it down, that's the end of that mission, you know, it's not going anywhere. So I accepted.
They had other plans for you and you had to say yes or get out of the Army, right?
Yep. That way you accept it. You accepted that you might as well get out of the Army because it's over. Yeah. And so
and that must have been about 1965, late 64, early 65.
68 too.
Okay. All right. So in those intervening years while you were at the Pentagon, you were trying to volunteer and go back. And those were really years where the activity in Vietnam heated up. I mean, we sent our first large-scale ground unit ashore in Vietnam in March of 1965. And so up through the beginning of 1968, all the troop levels started growing exponentially, it seemed. The draft boards ginned up and there were a lot more people going into the Army that knew that they were headed to Vietnam. And of course, the American public, for the very first time, were watching the war on TV in their living rooms. And so there were more and more deaths of American service members. And the sentiment in the country started changing about the war. This time you were stateside, you knew what else was happening politically and socially. And, you know, I'm sure you got updates about what was happening in Vietnam. And you could see some of that dynamic. What kind of changes were you seeing in our country related to the war in Vietnam, and what were your feelings about it?
I found one that you're either an American or you're not. And the philosophy that I have to this day is first you commit the country, then you commit the armed services. We are not mercenaries. We are citizens. The Army, military, and I've said this in our speeches at the wall, the Army or the military has never lost a war in the history of our country. The nation might have done some, but we haven't, because we move at the will of the American people. That's what that ballot's all about. you had all these dynamics going on at the same time. There was 16 reasons that a person who wanted to volunteer could be exempted from the draft. The draft boards were riddled with, and I served on a couple of committees and councils to go around and check this out. The draft boards were familiar with, they used to call it street sweepers. So you got people who were not qualified, they keep them up and they put them in the service, or they would volunteer and they would draft them and disproportionate their numbers. I used to go out, I went to one transportation unit, I'll never forget it, in Maryland at the time, that had, it was a transportation unit that did it mostly just moving cargo. Their education level was 16.3 years. That means most of these folks were college graduates, but they used that and accepted that position because they didn't want to go to the war. And so those, the kinds of manipulations that you had to deal with from a social point of view. Now you add to that the fact that the racial tone in the country was going to hell in a handbasket. But the fact of the matter is, the systems were not self-correcting. You could not have faith in the systems. So a lot of people who came back from being drafted in the military, having served in Vietnam, came back home and could not get into positions in reserve components, which were required by law. They had been politicized to the point that they could not go and perform those duties that they'd been trained to do, had served in combat to do, and abide by the law. So then you had this dynamic picking up in the social circumstances and all that kind of stuff. Then you take the riots, for example. That's another dynamic. What formation do you have? And when you deploy reserve component units, what should the composition be? How should the mix be when you're going to town A versus town B, and town A is in the south and town B is in the north? All of those things had to be considered. At the same time, Mr. McNamara was trying to integrate the Reserve and National Guard into one component. And you talk about a disaster. That brought more trauma to the system than you can ever imagine. So when I was assigned to the Pentagon, this is the kinds of things that we dealt with. And they were absolutely challenging and contributed to the already existing upward mobility of people that needed to have some social understanding. And and you had, the various riots. I served on the Williams board where we went out to determine the cause as best we could in certain key cities of the riots, and what should the composition of the reserve component units that they were sending in there be. And so we talked about the mix, how they should use it, what should the requirements be, and how should the commanders operate in that circumstance. When they were reinforced by units that had already met the standards, complicated to say the least. So you had the war overseas, then you had the problems at home, all impacting on the military service and its readiness.
Well, so after your time in the Pentagon, you accepted the battalion command position in Panama. Yes. So you went down to Panama, and how long were you there?
2 years.
2 years.
When I was in Panama, I got selected to go to the War College, attend the War College in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. But that assignment in Panama was a great assignment because from the Command and General Staff College, we had such a great interaction with our fellow students from Central and South America until there were 25 countries that I could call people in and get a direct answer from somebody whom I'd been in the Command and General Staff College with. And that happened around the world. So that's the type of camaraderie we developed through the service school and the service interaction. Never any question of patriotism, never any question of who did what to whom, never trying to change that philosophy, but having a camaraderie that was second to none.
Yeah. So you had personal relationships with these folks who ended up being leaders in their own militaries. by virtue of being selected to attend the military schools in the U.S. They were already on that leadership path.
Yep. I recall when I would take my armored personnel carrier, I had the only armored personnel unit south of the Rio Grande. And so when I would go out and I would take these young commanders who came out of their countries and what have you, and they come to visit, and we had a section in Panama that was selling military equipment to the countries. And of course, being the guy that had the tanks, I would take them out, put them in a command vehicle, and go out, and we just ride along, and he'd see this dust behind him, and he'd see this big trail of from the vehicles back there. And invariably, one of the comments would be, if I had a unit like this, I'd take over my country. I said, if you had a unit like this, I'd kick your ass in about 20 minutes.
Well,
and you know, and we treated with some level of temperance, but I was amazed that in certain circumstances, even the best would want to be in charge of their country. And the idea of being in charge means they already knew what was wrong. They just were not in a position to handle it. And so you just sort of kept it on the low ground and tried to maintain some balance.
Well, we'll come back to this topic after our discussion here today, because I've walked some of that same ground, and we'll have to have that longer conversation.
Okay, we'll
so
do that.
you went to the War College at Carlisle. Were you a colonel by that time? A full colonel?
No, I was a lieutenant colonel.
Okay.
And there was a class of 215. I want to say, I think that's the number. I'd be wrong, but there were 3 blacks in that class. Charlie Rogers, who had the Congressional Medal of Honor, Herb Dowles, who was a Navy officer, and myself. I'm the only one that's still here, to the best of my knowledge. But that class did great, as did the Commander General Staff College of 64. It was an enormous class. We had some great officers in there, and they proved their mettle. And so I consider that a great fortune to have been exposed to all of my classmates.
So that was about 1971?
Yeah.
Okay. So after you graduated from the War College, where did you go?
I went to Germany to command the brigade. I was on the promotion list to colonel, but they couldn't get it done before I got to Germany. And so that was great consternation whether I should take over this major command in the 3rd Infantry Division, which is where I started my career. I had the 3rd Brigade at Aschaffenburg. And that was a great brouhaha, because I'm taking over from a colonel and I'm a lieutenant colonel. And I said, if you let me sign the command line, I think I can manage it. And so they hemmed and hawed around and all that, but I got to command and it worked out successfully. And so that, you know,
well, and a lot of people now
challenge. And now the measure I have for that is I still hear from the young officers that served in that command, and it's like a brotherhood. That's the greatest thrill you can have, man. When you see these guys, they come out and they're successful, and yet they remember that was the glue that put it together. It's very gratifying. And 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had dinner with several members of that brigade, and it was very gratifying to see them and to have them remember it.
Well, a lot of people may have forgotten that, you know, 1971, 1972, we had over 100,000 troops in Germany and along the NATO border facing the Soviet Union. I mean, the Cold
Mhm.
War was at full swing at that time. Even though Vietnam was going on, the Cold War was going on too. So that was very dangerous in and of itself for very different reasons. So it wasn't a joke. It was real world stuff, and I imagine that your experience in Korea and in Vietnam was a great example to some of the younger troops there that were facing down the big Soviet Union.
Well, yeah, but the one thing we missed in that I was also assigned to Germany as a captain, infantry, as soon as I left the career course.
Mhm.
And I was assigned, and I had hoped to have a command of a rifle company. And at that time, we had the Pentomic Division, so it was the 5 companies, a brigade or what have you, a group. So I was assigned to this battalion, and I said, no, here we go. And the Army had a history that they assigned minority officers to logistics or maintenance or whatever the case may be, but not the whole high profile advanced in career enhancing assignments, we used to call them. And so when I got there, I began to question my assignment there. And I guess this question must have got all the way up the tape, because General Edelman was the four-star commander in Europe at that time. And I asked the question one last time, and said, well, why am I assigned here? I came out of the career course. I should have had a command in one of these companies. That's when you had the Pentomic Division. You only had 5 companies in a brigade or regiment or what the equivalent was. And I said, I should have had one of those commands. And some guy called me one day and said, you know why you have that job? He said, ESS. Said, what do you mean ESS? He said, Edelman said so. That took care of my question.
It's a new rule in the Army.
It took care of my question real quick. And I all of a sudden became from a flapper to happy. It was one of the best assignments I had. It really was. It was just great to see that it could all work out. And we had people in that battalion from every branch of service in the Army. And but it was a nuclear battalion. And we maintained the nuclear warheads of all of 5th Corps at 2/3 of the Army in Europe. And there were only 2 battalions that were the 101st Ordnance and the 15th. And so it was a challenge. And we did development of how to move warheads, how to disassemble them, how to take the core unit and put it on a helicopter and fly it up there and send the rest by road. All of those things that we did as a battalion. And the more interesting thing was the battalion commander was not black when I first got there, but it eventually became black. Colonel Merle Smith became the commander. He was black. I was the operations officer as a captain. I was black. And Art Holmes, General Holmes, was a technical operation officer, and he was there. So we go to a meeting, and we come up to the desk to sign into this super secret nuclear operation. They said, why are you all here? I said, well, we're on the list. And we're supposed to be there. No. The logistic stuff and supply stuff is over here. This is nuclear. And I said, yeah, if you want to find out, go ask Colonel Eifler whether we belong in this meeting. And this guy was dumb enough to do that. And Colonel Eifler got it, this Nichols, of course, he had personally decided that was his project to have us all be assigned. And he said, who is it that says these officers are not eligible to come into this conference? When you looked around the table, all the chairs were empty. There was nobody there. The Colonel Eifler said, go ahead and get your seats, pick up your packets. So,
And that was the end of that.
That took care of that. I tell you, and of course, Art Holmes was Major General retired. So we didn't do too badly. So,
Well, sir, I know you and I could sit here and talk all day, but I want to be respectful of your time. So I want to get toward, the time that the wall was conceived by Jan Scruggs in 1979. I know that you were one of the early supporters of the effort to build the memorial. When the design was unveiled, it was very controversial for a lot of reasons. You know, Maya Lin, the designer, there was some controversy over the fact that she was very young, over the fact that she was Asian American, over the fact that she was a woman in a very male-dominated field of architecture. But the design itself was also controversial for a couple of reasons. You know, a lot of people expected a more traditional statuary type of component. And the fact that it is made of black granite when almost everything else in DC is white. So the design being below ground became part of an issue. And so during all of this controversy, during all of this controversy, it was actually called the Black Gash of Shame and Sorrow at one point. And the controversy was so intense that construction of the memorial was actually held up. And there were meetings about it up on Capitol Hill. And my understanding is you were in on some of those meetings. So how did you get connected with the effort to build the memorial? What do you recall from that controversy? What was your role in it? And how did you feel about some of these objections to the design?
Jim, let me take a quick liberty here. I was brought up in an environment that said be open and fair, and human beings are human beings. So I had no axe to grind with many of the things that people were doing. There was an effort to discredit all the hard work that had been done. I backed into serving the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund because none of our leaders, African-American leaders, were paying attention to it. They wanted no parts of it. They'd rejected it. And Bill Edward, who was a Marine, very seriously wounded in a chair, was the military advisor and committee chair of the National Urban League. And he had asked me to come in and do some work with the Urban League because they were doing tutoring in New York, but cadets from West Point going in to do that. And from that, I got the chance to know Bill Edward very well. And I already had known Mr. Vernon Jordan. We didn't have a social relationship, but I knew who he was. But when the memorial discussion was coming up, Bill, he needed somebody to represent one of the organizations. He couldn't get anybody to come and even touch it. And so he called me out of desperation and said, I got to have somebody go out there, John Price. We can't let them start this monument of this magnitude without somebody being there. And I said, well, when you need me, I only must a day and a half out. And I said, okay, you sure you can't get anybody else? You want me to try somebody? He said, no, I've tried them all, and I've tried them all several times. And nobody's interested. I said, I'll be there. And when I went down, I think I went the night before somewhere they had a little meeting, so I wouldn't go out there as a stranger. And I met Jan and all the top group that was Duback and all that, Wheeler, trying to get the final organization together. And I went in and they said, hey, I'm here to help and to represent Bill Edward and the National Urban League and all that. And I heard what they were saying, and I said, well, look, if you don't mind, I'll help as much as I can, and I'll stay here as long as Bill Edward tell me this not going to create a firestorm, and I'll do it even then. That doesn't bother me. And so I went to the, I guess it was a groundbreaking ceremony or something like that. And but I got a chance then to know them and see that they were serious, and they had a great plan. And I thought it was worthy because I was very aware, thanks to my great teachers, that there was very little representation on the mall of anything that looked, acted, or was like us. And that's before all the decisions on color and that was done. So I got all this background and what Jan and those were trying to do and how they're trying to excite folk to raise the capital and all that business. And so I got involved with that. And, from that point forward, I felt I was a part of the team. Well, there were some people who couldn't get what they wanted to do in terms of influencing how the memorial was going to be. They wanted this, let's punish the enemy, the horseback riders and that kind of crap. And the simple fact of the matter was, the decision was made to have a national competition. And there were people who were being influenced by outside influences to satisfy their own requirements, needs, I guess. And so we proceeded to go through the process of whatever it was. And so they organized the largest architectural design competition ever. I think they had 1,200 entries, if my memory serves me right, something in that magnitude. And the board went through. It was a world-renowned group of artists. They made the decisions. When they made the decision, then everybody flipped out. That's when all those names that you mentioned were called. Black Gash of Shame, she's Asian, I should understand that. And I put up with it, and I told her, we're really cool on this. This is not going anywhere. That's not the way it ought to be. The decision was made. We need to abide by the decision. That's what we said we're going to do. And then we went to another meeting, I want to say in Senator Warner's office, and they were discussing all of this business. And another one of these young bucks got up, well, no, she's a Black Gash of Shame. That's the one where it got so famous because I think the reporters were there. And she doesn't understand that. She's Asian. What does she know? And a lot of Black Gash of Shame. And who wants something black out on the mall? And then I got up and jumped his ass like it was a new moon. And I told him, you mention that one more time, I'm going to show you what a black ass will do. I'm going to pull a grenade with the pen out of it, put it in your goddamn mouth. You need to sit down and shut up and let the thing go. And I told Senator Warner, you need to vote for it up or down, one way or the other. We fooled around with this long enough. That was a classically run program. It needs to be approved. We need to get on with this. Otherwise, we're never going to get the wall built. We need to do that right now. And Senator Warner said, okay. And they asked for all who was for it, and everybody raised their hand.
And that was that. Well, I mean, you've been quoted there in one of those meetings where there were reporters as saying, "Black is not a color of shame," and I'm tired of hearing it called such by you. We're all equal in combat, and color shouldn't matter now.
That's true. I did say that.
So
I also on the sidebar gave him some sidebar things, like I was going to put a grenade up his butt and pull the pin if he kept running his mouth.
I think he learned his lesson, and I think after your comments there, it wasn't called the Black Gash of Shame anymore.
No, but I was amazed at the number of people. Well, we had the same thing with the other statue too, but I was amazed at the number of people who was so wanted to have these charging animals that they're now blowing up all over the country, as a symbol of success. And you didn't need that at all. Maya Lin changed the way the entire world now does memorials. That's the impact she had. She changed the whole dynamic. And there are more walls with names on it and tributes to people in little towns when you go through them. It makes your heart just burst with pride when you see how much this young woman had an influence on how we celebrate the contributions of people in our country. And I think it's phenomenal. And this wasn't a frivolous architectural competition. This was big time. I mean, really big time. And she won it. And she deserves all the praise she can get for turning our country, and quite frankly, turning the world around on how we proceed honoring people for good deeds. And I admire him more to this day than anybody, you know, that gets into this business. You really have to have a sense of feeling in order to make that work.
Well, so you've actually been a part of the wall since before there was actually a wall. Over 40 years now. For you, what has the wall meant to you as a Vietnam veteran, a Korean War veteran, a veteran of our country? And what do you think it has meant to our country in large?
I think the wall represents what America can do when it puts its mind to it. It puts its energy to it. When we all come together. I was mentioning it to my wife last night. I said, I got to remind Jim that one night some veterans and I was sitting there talking. We said what the country needs now is an organization called FACT, and that's Free America from Contaminated Thinking. And that's where we are. The thinking is so contaminated now, you can't find out what's clear water and what's dirty water. And we really need to get back on track. And that's what it's all about. We need to get our country back where it can live up to its full potential. And that's a great step in the right direction. And that, to me, is what she did. She got us back off this brouhaha guru, let's go stab somebody, to let's just tell them we appreciate what you did, we're sorry for your loss, and be done with it. And that's the genesis of that. And we need work on that right now. And I still think that one of the things we said still holds fast. Right now, there's so much contaminated thinking in America that everybody wants to go out here that way, over there that way, to satisfy their own personal grievance. But from a national point of view, it doesn't do a thing for anybody. And that's sad.
Well, what do you tell young people about the Vietnam War? What do you hope future generations will learn about the memorial 40 years from now when our Vietnam veterans are gone?
I think, frankly, we have to start teaching history, in fact, as a part of the lifeblood of our education system. Not biased history, clean-cut history. I think we need to do the same thing with the arts, music. That is a part of our character. That's what we'll build on. And we need to make room for everybody at the table. We need to stop identifying ourselves by race and identify ourselves by nationality. It's your nationality is the glue that keeps us together. Most folk don't even remember when Made in America dominated the whole world. They act like that never existed. We started the whole damn thing. And we ought to try to go back and reclaim it because that represented good. We've got to rethink this proposition of we are one nation that's there for all of us, not some of us. And I think it's doable, but you've got to really, really be interested in doing something for everybody. And I don't mean people who won't work and get over on the system and all that. It's no fun to me. When somebody tells me I got over, I say, yeah, and you cost me a bunch of damn money, so don't tell me about you got over. One of us got over, I didn't. So I don't need to hear that. And that, but you see, you have to set that attitude straight. I think we need to realize that we have to have a role model. Let's give the youth their youth back. All these old folks running around here, acting like they're teenagers. They don't have any world to grow into. I recall back in again, I use my hometown as a reference. When you realize people were paying attention to you, they'd make a comment like, hey, I think you're a man now that you got some hair growing on that upper lip, but you're not there yet. When you become a man, you'll look like me. Well, half the guys I see right now, hell, I would want to look like them on Halloween. So that's the way that works. So that's kind of the philosophy that we need to start getting back to, get some structure. Freedom ain't free, and we need to get some serious structure and bring our communities all back together. We can do that. All we got to do is put our mind to it. But
Well,
that's got to be selfless.
I know you've spoken at the wall a number of times, and I was watching the video of you speaking at the wall in 1998. And you said something there that I thought was inspiring and something we don't hear much of these days. And your comment was to the effect that when we look at ourselves as a country, we have to remember we're not as bad as we think we are, but we're nowhere as good as we ought to be. And so, you know, there are a lot of problems in our country, but, you know, in so many ways, we're still better than most every other country in the world. And we need to remember we're not as bad as we think we are. But we're also not as good as we ought to be.
And I still feel that same way. We can do a lot better by each other if we stop worrying about trivia and stop worrying about who got on first, when, and how. The simple fact of the matter is we got to use inspiration, fairness, justice, and stop making excuses when somebody does something wrong. We've got to get common sense back in the equation. You know, how much it costs is not the solution. How much it costs is a way to get something that you probably don't need. But the simple fact of the matter is, what we need more of is fortitude, persistence, participation, practical approach, and get the job done. It's everybody's problem to solve, and every little bit helps. It's not all big and grandiose. We all can do this pulling together. And I just think we got to feel that we need to do that with each other, for each other, and by each other. And we can make it work. That those speeches I gave at the War of Vietnam were inspired by that wall and all the people I've seen go down there. It's not just a frivolous, moment in the sun. We've had some serious people go there, and a lot of people who our attendance is dropping off, and it's noticeable. And we need to sort of ring that chime and inspire these folks to make the time to come out, make the time to pay attention. It doesn't matter what veteran you're from and from what war. If you're a veteran, you're welcome at the wall, because you see yourself on that wall in one fashion or another. You know, the lines go, and it's like that tree we see all the time with the names on it. And I think we need to let people know that patriotism is still a fact of life. There are patriots out there right now that will die in a heartbeat to protect somebody from ill and ill will. And we got to recognize those people. We can't just let them come out there and be drug out and thrown in a hole in a body bag and say we did everything we could do for them. That's not the case at all. We've got to make this thing stay alive as long as there's people on the earth, and there are people who won't do what is in the best benefit of all the people, all the time. And Jim, I think this is a great instrument to do that. And I certainly think that one of the highest points, if not the high points of my life, was to be able to participate in this program, the Vietnam War. And I think all the efforts you all made at educating the population to be sure the kids had benefit from that knowledge, and it's been very gratifying for me. But I think the kids, and I hope they did, benefited from the great effort that went into it and the great role that the Vietnam Veteran War Fund played in it. And I think we sometimes forget that. But I still think it's doable, and I still think we need to get this fact proposition going and free our country from a lot of this contaminated thinking. And don't let anybody divide us. That'd be the worst thing that could happen to us. You're not going to move forward if you can't start looking that way.
Well, sir, as always, you're an inspiration to me. I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate your time. I look forward to having more conversations with you. And just thank you so much for joining us here.
Well, it's my pleasure to be invited.